She was old all my life, even when I was sitting in the red dirt, fascinated with my own toes. Ava's face had a line in it for every hot mile she ever walked, for every fit she ever threw. Her hair was long and black as crows, streaked with white, and her eyes, behind the ancient yellowed glass of her round spectacles, were pale, pale blue, almost silver. The blind have eyes like that color, but Ava could see fine. Ava could see forever. She could tell your fortune by gazing into the dregs of your coffee cup, and swore that if the bottoms of your feet itched, you would walk on strange ground. She could be as gentle as a baby bird, as sweet as divinity candy. But if her prescription was off, or if she just got mad, she would sit bolt upright in bed at 3 o'clock in the morning and dog cuss anyone who came to mind, even the dead. Some days she would doze in her rocker and speak softly to people that I could not find, even by looking under the porch. Now I know she was just listening to her dreams. In her time, she would bury 2 daughters, one just a baby, one full grown. And when she passed 80, my aunts just stopped telling her when people she loved had died. A kindness, I suppose. Near the end of her life, when her mind began to wobble, she would recall how pretty my ex-wife looked at Christmas dinner 18 years ago, yet not remember yesterday. But when I think of her now, I think of a woman still strong and hard in her late 60s, a woman with a banjo propped against the foot of her bed, 10,000 hairpins in the pocket of her dress, and more personalities than the state hospital in Tuscaloosa.
Thought it scarcely worth his while to waste much time on the old violin. But he held it up with a smile. "What am I bidding, good folks?" he cried. "Who'll start the bidding for me? $1, $1. Then 2, only 2. $2, and who'll make it 3? $3 once, $3 twice. Going." But no. From the room far back, a gray-haired man came forward and picked up the bow. And wiping the dust from the old violin and tightening the loosened strings, he played a melody so pure and sweet as a caroling angel sings. The music ceased, and the auctioneer, in a voice that was quiet and low, said, "What am I bid for the old violin?" And he held it up with a bow. $1,000, and who'll make it 2? 2,000, and who'll make it 3? 3,000 once, 3,000 twice. Going and gone, said he. The people cheered, but some of them cried, "We quite don't understand. What changed its worth?" Swift came the reply, "The touch of the master's hand." And many a man with life out of tune, thus battered and scarred with sin, is auctioned cheap to the thoughtless crowd, much like the old violin. A mess of pottage, a glass of wine, a game, and he travels on. He's going once, he's going twice. He's going, he's almost gone. But the master comes, and the foolish crowd can never quite understand the worth of a soul and a change that's wrought by the touch of the master's hand.
And again, 2 minutes, please.
This is from A Bond Between Women, A Journey to Fierce Compassion by China Galland. It's from the prologue called The Story of Durga. The world stood poised on the brink of destruction once before. Rivers dried up, plants refused to grow, people starved, there was war everywhere. Slaughter prevailed, dancing stopped, even singing was forgotten. The demons were loose in the world, raging unchecked across heaven and earth, drunk with destruction. No one could stop them, not even the gods who had been defeated one by one. Humiliated, the gods withdrew to the heights of the Himalayas and took counsel amongst themselves, but to no avail. They had lost all power against these demons and could only leave the world to its inevitable destruction. Then it was remembered. This time had been foretold. A demon would come to destroy the world, and only a woman could defeat this demon. Only a woman could save the world. At this, the gods shot forth streams of fire, and their fiery streams converged into a towering pillar of flames as high as the Himalayas themselves, and out of this fire came the great goddess Durga herself, blazing with the light of 1,000 suns, radiating her splendor and love throughout the universe. She was riding a lion, wearing a crescent moon, smiling serenely. Durga had 10 arms and hands, all of them holding a weapon given to her by the gods themselves. The great goddess Durga, the warrior queen, whose very name means fortress, unassailable, beyond reach. She rose up to fight the great demon and all his forces. She rode into battle with a roar that shook the earth.
Henry and the Buccaneer Bunnies. Cruising the 7 seas on a rickety old ship called the Salty Carrot sailed a wild, rowdy band of Buccaneer Bunnies. They were bad bunnies, all right. When pirates on other ships saw their long, floppy ears and their fluffy, white tails, they shook with fear. The captain of the Salty Carrot was Barnacle Blackear, the baddest bunny brute of all time. Blackear was proud of his wooden paw, his golden earrings, and his mean reputation. What Blackear was not proud of was his son, Henry. Instead of performing his proper pirating duties, Henry was more interested in reading books. Books the Buccaneers stole from other ships. Blackear ordered, "Shout shiver me timbers." "I'd rather finish this chapter," said Henry. "Make this prisoner walk the plank." "Can't I just read about it?" asked Henry. "Find yourself a parrot for your shoulder." "First, I need to read up on parrot care," said Henry. "Buccaneer bunnies don't need books. Toss them overboard." "No, wait, let me just finish them first."
Susan McCann, and I'm reading from Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone by J.K. Rowling. Chapter 1, The Boy Who Lived. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large mustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the neck, the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences, spying on the neighbors. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion, there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret, and the greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think they could bear it if anyone found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't even have a sister, because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursley-ish as it was possible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbors would say if the Potters arrived in the street. The Dursleys knew the Potters had a small son, too, but they had never seen him. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on the dull gray Tuesday our story starts, there was nothing about the cloudy skies outside to suggest that strange and mysterious things would be soon happening all over the country. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked out his most boring tie for work, and Mrs. Dursley gossiped away happily as she wrestled a screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed a large tawny owl flutter past the window.
Please read.
Marley was dead to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he chose to put his name to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Mine. I don't mean to say that I know of my own knowledge what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade. But the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile. You will therefore permit me to repeat emphatically that Marley was as dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew he was dead? Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and he were partners for I don't know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole assign, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend, and sole mourner. And even Scrooge was not so dreadfully cut up by the sad event, but that he was an excellent man of business on the very day of the funeral and solemnized it with an undoubted bargain. Well, the mention of Marley's funeral brings me back to the point I started from. There is no doubt that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I'm about to relate. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire, secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheeks, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. He carried his own low temperature always about with him. He iced his office in the dog days and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas.
A man stood upon a railroad bridge in northern Alabama, looking down into the swift water 20 feet below. The man's hands were behind his back, the wrists bound with a cord. A rope closely encircled his neck. It was attached to a stout cross timber above his head, and the slack fell to the level of his knees. Some loose boards supplied a footing for him and his executioners, 2 soldiers of the Federal Army, directed by a sergeant. At a short remove upon the same temporary platform was an officer. He was a captain. A sentinel at each end of the bridge stood with his rifle. It did not appear to be the duty of these 2 men to know what was occurring at the center of the bridge. They merely blockaded the 2 ends of the foot planking that traversed it. Beyond one of the sentinels, nobody was in sight. The railroad ran straight away into a forest. The other bank of the stream was open ground, topped with a stockade of vertical tree trunks loopholed for rifles. Midway of the slope between bridge and fort were the spectators, a single company of infantry in line at parade rest. A lieutenant stood at the right of the line, the point of his sword upon the ground, his left hand resting upon his right. Excepting the group of 4 at the center of the bridge, not a man moved. The company faced the bridge, staring stonily, motionless. The sentinels, facing the banks of the stream, might have been statues to adorn the bridge. The captain stood with folded arms, silent, observing the work of his subordinates, but making no sign. Death is a dignitary who, when he comes announced, is to be received with formal manifestations of respect, even by those most familiar with him.